I'm delighted to have Andy Gabruch as my guest today on Sidewalk, Skyline podcast. Andy and his family live in Vancouver, where he has quite the hat collection. This man wears a lot of hats. Besides being a husband to Annick and father to 4 teens, he's the pastor of Home Church, formerly known as Vancouver Chinese Pentecostal Church. Andy has his Doctor of Ministry in Semiotic Studies on Christ, Culture, and the Church from George Fox University. And he teaches the Contemporary Communication course at Summit Pacific College. Dr. Andy Gabruch has a mentoring ministry called DUCO, and it means to lead for today. Since 2016, DUCO has intentionally mentored 40 plus young leaders towards full-time ministry, coached dozens of churches on leading, reaching, and discerning younger generations, various strategic projects with nonprofit organizations, and planted 5 next generation ministries when he was the next generation's director with the PAOC, British Columbia and Yukon district. He's written dozens of resources on ministerial leadership and discipleship, and he's releasing his first book, Infobesity, How to Be Followers of Jesus in an Information Overload World. And I think I probably just scratched the surface, and there's a bunch more things that you've done, Andy, and are involved in. But all of this begs the question, why am I thinking I can ask any intelligent questions for such a smart guy as you? Welcome, Andy.
Great. Yeah, even hearing that creates some busyness in my own mind.
Yeah.
But it's great to be with you and your podcast family. Thank you.
Thank you. So, well, let's start out talking a bit about your family. Tell me about Annick and the 4 kids, and what part of your life do they play?
Yeah, I have a fantastic opportunity to be part of a great family. So Annick and I have been married for 21 years. She grew up in a small little town called Canal Flats in British Columbia. And it's a unique town because a lot of Quebecois families moved from Quebec to come to BC. And so she comes from a French Catholic background. Her mom and dad found Jesus through a Pentecostal church when they were quite young in Quebec and moved to BC for a better life for their kids. And Annick and I met at a summer camp actually as friends, but we didn't date till 5 years later and got married in 2003. And from there, we went to pastor as a couple. And my whole family, even to this point, have seen ministry as a family. That's been a huge win, Kev. So my kids get ministry. It's not about a dad show here or a mom pop shop. It's a whole family deal. My oldest, Isabel, she's 18. She's at Summit Pacific College right now, taking the Omega degree. She wants to be in youth ministry and counseling. My second, Joseph, is in grade 12, and he actually just applied for Summit this week, and he's going into the lead pastor track or the pastoral theology track. And then my third one, Ben, he is in grade 8. He feels called into youth ministry. That was just recently. And I got to be honest with you, Kev, we're like, Ben, you don't have to follow your brother and sister. Like, take your own path. But he
Yeah,
feels
yeah.
called. He feels the whispers. And so we just want to come alongside him. And then my youngest, Samuel, he's in grade 7. He's 12 right now. And so he's, they're all figuring out their journey. But I think part of it is we've seen ministry as a family. And so they've all served. They love it. So I'm very thankful and grateful for Annick and my kids to allow me to do all this, and at the same time do life with me.
Yeah, that's amazing. I'm curious about home church. Is that
Mhm.
the one that Rex Eng used to pastor?
Yeah, so Rex Ing was the pastor of Vancouver Chinese Pentecostal Church for 10 years, and he came from Agincourt from Toronto.
Hmm.
And at that time, it was one of the strongest peaks of the church, and they were going through a discernment process of how do we become more neighborhood, and that was a very difficult process for a church. Here's a monocultural, well-established church that actually planted four different monocultural churches in Vancouver, throughout the Vancouver network, and also one in Calgary. So Rex came in knowing that there had to be change, but he cultivated a lot of help to get me to this point to be able to help the church go through change. And that's kind of where I came in, is here's a church that wants to change but doesn't necessarily know how to, and
Hmm.
how to do
Hmm.
that well. That was the big key here for home church.
Yeah, so talk to me about being a change agent. I
Mhm.
mean, this is an immigrant-based monoculture church doing what all churches in that uh, parameter have to do. They have to eventually adapt because their
Mhm.
children and their grandchildren are
Right.
all being raised as Canadians. They're falling in love with Canadians, getting married, starting families. And so, um, are you the first non-Cantonese pastor in that church?
Yeah, great. That's another great question. So they've had non-Cantonese speaking pastors on staff. They even had Pastor Henry Burzell. He was the first lead pastor who was non-Cantonese, but he came from a Cantonese background. He was a
Mm,
missionary in China. So I'm actually the first Canadian Caucasian pastor, lead pastor of the church. And they've recognized, even in city, and you would see this, Kevin, is as the city shifts and changes the neighborhoods, then churches have to adjust and adapt to reach
mhm,
the people that are in the neighborhood. And so, to their credit, they were reaching out to Cantonese speaking people because they were flooding into the area of Riley Park, Mount Pleasant. But now that has shifted, simply to your point, is now they're second generation, third generation. And so Caucasian or English language is the first language, is roughly 60% now, where Cantonese is dipping less than 15%. So we recognized that the neighborhood was shifting and changing. Northern Hollywood lives there. Some of the most affluent families about my age and stage of life live there, that live in the city, or sorry, work in the city and come out to Mount Pleasant, Riley Park area. So the church recognized that the neighborhood was shifting and changing. And not only that, their families were. And this was
mhm,
the sad reality, is because they weren't necessarily knowing how to change, their family members would go to other churches, Canadian churches, Canadian context churches, rather than a Chinese church, because there was programs or events or services for their families, where that wasn't necessarily the case. The other thing I would mention too, which monocultural churches tend to do well at, is they do know how to reach their culture.
mhm,
Um, and so as we become more and more of a multicultural network in Canada, 1.2 million people for this year alone, they definitely have an opportunity for outreach, but to integrate into Canadian culture and into the Canadian church is another aspect that VCPC has desired to do before I was on staff. And
mhm,
so when we came on staff, we already had a pipeline of how to change, and why to change, but the what is something that was through a process since I started. So the other thing I would mention too is just their willingness to change. So when
mhm,
I came on and they voted me as their lead pastor, it was 100% vote.
mm,
So they voted 100% yes, and they didn't have lots of members. They had 65 members in the room and about 100 people. But for them to give 100% vote to me and to my family, that gave us some confidence that they're saying yes to change as well.
Mm-hmm. So you're dealing with a lot of maybe different expectations,
Oh yeah.
different ideas of what change is, how far change goes. Tell me about it. Like, have you created any sparks?
Yeah, this is a great question. And you're not the first one who's asked me this since I've started at VCPC, where we've gotten to this point, and I'll share the story with you. But my goal was not change, Kevin.
Mhm.
My goal was unity and oneness.
Yeah.
And my goal was the Acts 15:28, which was kind of our theme verse for the year, what seems right to us in the Holy Spirit.
Mhm.
So there was episodes in the New Testament, especially in Acts. There's 7 episodes actually, that every time the church dealt with a problem. So if you're listening to this and you're trying to do change management, let me just encourage you with this. The church shifted and pivoted in the early context in Acts, because every time the church dealt with a problem, they brought the problem to the table, they prayed through it, discerned it. Of course, the Holy Spirit was leading them, but there was 3 realities that happened. Unity was strengthened, or oneness. Spiritual maturity rose or rise to the surface, and there was numerical growth.
Mhm.
Those 3 were positive consequences of oneness. And I would deter that it's not necessarily about change. It's about creating the culture for change to foster and to be developed and to experiment and to discern God's best. And that was the
Mhm.
second thing.
Mhm.
So oneness. The second thing is I just help the congregation realize that God's already leading us. This is not Andy Gabruch church.
Right.
It's, I would tease them. I'd be like, we can call it Jackie Chan church. Like, I don't really care. Like, for me, it's not about the name change or the process. For me, it's to, as a congregation, to be great followers of the leader of leaders, which
Mhm.
is
Mhm.
Jesus. The Holy Spirit leads us. And those 2 things, as soon as we were able to go through roughly a 4 or 5 month process, everything else happened. So the sparks of change do come, but that's a separate conversation. I didn't necessarily experience sparks as much as being a pastor when those sparks were about to ignite.
Right.
So you shepherd people through. Love goes a long way. Like, the BS meter of people are pretty high. And so if you come across with no other agenda than to love and to serve, help me understand why change has been so hard for you. There's a spectrum of change. If you're listening to this too, I would highly suggest a small little book by um, oh, why can't think of his name now, but the book is called Why Our Iceberg is Melting, and it's about change management. It's about penguins and Antarctica. And it talks about how there's the first quadrant is early adopters. They're with you no matter what, they see change. Then the second one is they have to be invited in through conversation and relationship to be part of that process to build oneness. The third one, and these are about 25% each, maybe,
Mhm.
depending on your context. And I would pause in here and enter into that book and say, this is where relational intelligence, this is where shepherding, this is where contextual intelligence becomes extremely important, because you have to shepherd these people. Um, and then the third one, like I mentioned, about 25% is you just got to show me. Like, quit talking about change. Let's just show me, make it happen. And if you show me some results, I'm in. And then there's about like 10% that are critical and negative. They're skeptical. They might come to agreements with the overall context, but they're not kicking and screaming. They're just like, it doesn't matter what you do, they're going to be critical. And
Yeah.
then there's 1%. It doesn't matter if someone gives you $1 million, or, Jesus comes back from heaven to earth. They're going to be upset about everything, you know?
Yeah.
So the book talks about using these relationships to foster and help people change. Don't create necessarily sparks as much as oneness moving forward. So that was really important for us. One is that God is leading us, and then the third one is some, I call them discernment exercises. So like a SWOT analysis,
Mhm.
um, that we would do through prayer meetings once a month. I had once a month vision updates. When it came to the name change, I invited the whole congregation to provide name change suggestions. I had 32 different names come up, and then you go through feedback loops to get to that name. We never thought of home church, honestly. Home church never came up on those 32 cards, but through the process, it came to that process. And so I'll mention that a bit. And then the last one that I would probably encourage others. So, create oneness. That's the culture part. Um, you know, help people understand that this is about Jesus. He's the head of the church. He's going to lead us and guide us, even through really difficult things. Do a SWOT analysis, and then the last one is one-on-one conversations. So I would meet with you and say, "Hey, Kev, tell me what you love about VCPC."
Mhm.
And all these amazing stories would come to the surface. Well, you want to use those stories as your value piece.
Mhm.
So what I said to the church is, I'm not here to change the church. I'm here to elevate what God's already done here for the next 75 years.
Mhm.
So here's a church that believes in family and the power of the Holy Spirit, missions, next generation, um, welcoming culture. I'm like, amazing. Let's do this for our neighborhood now. And they grabbed on.
It's a great name, home church,
Hmm.
I'm sure that there's a lot of nuance to that name as well, perhaps meaning
Yeah.
several things. How do people interpret that?
Yeah. So this is a great question. So the one way, when you create oneness, you create buy-in. You create not just buy-in, but your people's voices are being heard.
Mhm.
And the collective voice is more important than just an individual voice. And this is where VCPC got stuck. So when you think monocultural church, I'm trying to honor this church very well, but a patriarchal society, the one who makes the most money, who has the most education, has the largest voice.
Mm.
And so, but biblically speaking, that's not the context. The context is Jesus has the largest voice, and it happens collectively what seems right to us, not to Pastor Andy or to a board member or to someone who gives us $1 million. It's not that. What seems right to us and the Holy Spirit. And that context in Acts 15 is about lost people. It's about people who don't have a home,
Mm.
need to find a home. And so home church came out of an acronym, because when the church was going through a very difficult season, they would grab onto hope. Hope was a key word for the church. And so I wanted to honor the narrative or the story that God already had been doing at the church. And so it came up in our fourth feedback loop as a church that someone said, why don't we call it home church, which means Hope on Main and 18th. So we're right on the corner of 18th and Main. And it's one of the busiest, like I wish I could share with you and show you the street, but it's one of the most busiest streets on a Friday, Saturday, Sunday, because some of the best restaurants in Vancouver are in that area. Some of the best coffee shops in the world are in that area. So people come to that area, and we're thinking, why don't we offer hope to people? So that was a key word for us. But when someone said hope actually could be home church, which means Hope on Main and 18th, that clicked. And everyone jumped on. So we thought of three names. So we brought it down to Hope on Main and 18th, Home Church, and Main Street Church.
Mm.
And if I was honest with you, Kevin, there was a few people that do tithe and they were deeply part of the church that wanted to call it Main Street Church. But as soon as Home Church came to the surface, that name just grabbed people's attention
Yeah.
because people need a home. And
Yeah.
think of people coming from Hong Kong, coming to Vancouver, they're looking for home.
Hmm.
And so not just home, but a hope. And so our key was finding home in Jesus is the hope of the world. Um, Hope is not just having a girlfriend or a boyfriend or winning the lottery or get a great job. Hope is a person. His name's
Hmm.
Jesus.
Hmm.
And we tied our values within what home means. So yeah, it really has resonated. What's funny now is like it used to have Chinese letters on the church
Hmm.
front foyer, and we had to revitalize the building. That's a different conversation. But as soon as I started, it was a liability because the roof was actually sagging, like the front of the church was sagging. So I said, we got to get rid of this. We got to refix this, and because it's a liability. So we fixed it all up, but the church hasn't had a name since I started. Like there's no name on the church building, but we have a banner now on the inside of the overhead as people walk by, and people are taking pictures, and there's a QR code. We have people coming off the street because they resonate with home. And it's been nothing but exciting, honestly, Kev. I haven't had the sparks yet. I am waiting for them though. um but I just pastor people through those four quadrants. And in most contexts, people who are the most crankiest, they're grieving, and they just
Yeah.
need someone to love them through it and make sense, and they understand why. But at the same time, that's where the relational intelligence comes in.
So those four quadrants again, the first one
So
is the early adopters.
early adopters invited in through relationship, show me the results, and pastor me through it.
Yeah, which is hopefully not a quadrant. Hopefully,
Yes. Yeah.
hopefully it's a sliver.
Yeah, and you mentioned, yeah, you mentioned something key here too, is lots of people talk about change, but very few, if not just a handful, know how to change well.
Hmm.
It's one thing to say, oh, I want to lose 10 pounds and I don't want to eat McDonald's anymore. It's another thing to actually walk through it.
Hmm.
And that's the process that's a strategic one that we did to get to this point. If you go to our website too, you'll see our vision doc. So
Hmm.
this is kind of like it's all there of everything that we're offering,
Hmm. Hmm.
what we're looking for. But at the same time, we're still a Chinese context. We want to reach out to Chinese people moving to Vancouver. So
Yeah.
we honor the past, and yet we empower the present, and we look forward to the future.
Yeah. I should have mentioned earlier, but if you have anything you want to share on the screen, that's open on the Zoom call here. Uh,
Okay.
I want to, I mean, as we talk about making change and being an agent of change, or maybe a lightning rod for change, um, is that who Andy Gabruch has always been, or is that something that God had to shape? Were you always open to risk, or were you risk averse?
Great question. I this comes into some of the things that we will be talking about, but for me as a person, I've always been a change agent, simply because Jesus changed my life.
Yeah.
So, here I am as a 16-year-old kid. I wanted to be a businessman, lawyer, was bored with the things of this world, and I was invited to a youth rally actually, and it absolutely just rocked my world. It changed my life. It changed my trajectory. I thought I'd be, married with kids and retired at 30 with multiple businesses. And here I am, 44, working for a local church, but it's the best place for me to be. Um, and based on my life experience, my focus has been on next gen or younger generations. And so for younger generations, there's strategic elements to that. Like 2/3 of people come to Christ before the age of 18.
Mhm.
1/3 of people who feel called into vocational ministry do so in their teen and youth, young adult years.
Mhm.
And if you want to be on the cusp of reaching culture, it is through younger generations. And so that's what really appealed to me with VCPC. They wanted to go young. They recognized they needed to go younger, so to reach, lead, and disciple younger generations. So
Right.
I've always been in the cusp that way. And because of that and my unique story, I've been able to, that's why I did my doctorate in semiotics, because the church is meant to be prophetic. And if you look at even the context of the Ephesus reality, Paul talks about that the church is really the center of human activity because of the Holy Spirit energy in us. And so I want the church to continue to be innovative and creative.
Mm.
And that's kind of the conversation around technology.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. I just was listening to a podcast called The Sacred,
Mm,
and the host coined a phrase. I don't know if it was original to her or not, but she talked about Trinitarian anthropology,
mm,
the idea that our understanding of relationship really it originates in the Godhead. That the original family model is the Godhead, the Father, the Son, and the Spirit, and it to be a disciple of Jesus is to be invited into that family, and but it shapes our view of the world. This
exactly.
Trinitarian anthropology.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, and so with my work with Next Generation, we recognized that there was gaps that we wanted to fill with DUCO. So DUCO means to lead for today. It's a Latin term, and so we
Okay.
wanted to focus on leadership principles or leadership experiences or experiments for today. So we did mentorship tracks for younger leaders
Yeah.
and discipleship resources for a digital age, as
Mm-hmm.
well as strategic processes to help churches or organizations to think, lead, and reach young, because the digital age has actually flatlined authority. It's
Mm-hmm.
flatlined information. And so I can, even though Kevin, I respect you as a person, whatever you say, I can refute it online, or I can try to
Yeah.
find something else online.
Yeah.
This is the unique reality that we're living in the last 500 years. So the Gutenberg press actually flatlined authority as well, because now I
Mm-hmm.
can read the Bible, or I can read sciences, I can read philosophy, I could get whatever I need. It was a physical book.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Or now I call it the Zuckerberg era, or the Zuckerberg press, where now everything is digital. It's not necessarily healthy either,
Right.
but information has been flatlined. Now, not all information is equal, and that's why relationship, friend, is so important in our world today. So that's a very unique conversation in the next 10 to 15 years, maybe 30 years, about our relationship, even with technology. But human relationship with God, the Trinity, will
Mm-hmm.
become extremely important. How we see the world that continues to advance in technology,
Mm-hmm.
especially personal technology, I call it.
Yeah. So, I mean, you just wrote a book, Infobesity. Is it available now?
So it's on the last stages. So
Okay.
anyone who's written a book would understand that it's in a typesetting document. And it should be ready by the end of this year or January 2025.
Okay.
And so I wrote a book on infobesity, which means information overload. It was a term that was actually coined in 2005 when Google became really big. And Google in the early 2000s created a genius way to filter through information called algorithms. And because of that, based on your biases, based what you say, that it would filter through information what you like. But that's not
Mm-hmm.
necessarily leads to truth. So information overload, what I call it, is that it's the information that we interact with, that we consume, that we tend to lean on in digital spaces or places through digital technologies, that actually paralyzes, it can paralyze us from our creative purpose.
Mm-hmm.
so I was able to trademark Infobesity in North America um, around education and spirituality and leadership. So my doctorate was to test the whole thesis idea around Infobesity. And my doctorate, uniquely enough, started right when COVID happened. So I started my doctorate in January of 2020, and we became digitalized as a society, as a world, as a culture, as human beings in March of 2020. And so the process of the research has been a great timely resource, I hope, for the church.
Hmm.
So we created an assessment. The assessment is the first assessment in North America around spirituality and digital practices and
Mhm.
personal well-being. And the book is part of that. It will have a 30-day challenge as well, so that people can moderate their digital practices, but how to redeem them as well to be a follower of Jesus online. And to your point, is our relationship with technology and information actually shaping us? And is
Mhm.
it shaping us for positive or negative or both? And that is where we continue to gravitate. That's why I did my book on infobesity for the wider Christian community.
Yeah, you have, and we'll in the show notes be sure to include links to your website and
Sure.
other things we talk about here. Uh, but I noticed that you have a infobesity assessment tool online to help people diagnose if they're overdosing
Mhm.
on information. Some strategies for redeeming digital spaces. Um, so as people have been going through that infobesity assessment, what are some of the things that you're finding in the feedback? What are some things that you expected? Maybe some things that surprised you?
Yeah, that's a great question. So we've had 1,500 plus people complete the survey, and these are non-faith-based to faith-based families, teenagers, young adults, people that come from broken single homes or healthy homes, if you want to call it that way, and the spectrum of digital practices linking their personal well-being. There's a pendulum.
Hmm.
And the first part of the pendulum is people who are lovely and godly but addicted would say, Jesus doesn't live in my digital spaces. It doesn't matter. Like receiving digital information online through my digital technologies, like I love God, but I'm addicted and it's fine. So I call
Yeah.
it receiving any information without the filter systems that we need to create. And the
Hmm.
younger that people do, the harder it is to filter because they don't have the cognitive realities yet to be able to do that well. And
Right.
so that's why relationships become important, or to do it together.
So are
So
you talking there about more than just like pornography, but also the voices that they expose themselves to, the kind of unfiltered approach with that lacks critical thinking, some of those kind of things, or
yeah, most of everything you mentioned would come down to actually two words: is social media. So you can find all of those things on social media as a grab.
yeah.
Um, and so when I say that we're consuming information, receiving information from digital platforms, digital media, or social media, it actually, some people think that whether it's pornography or not, Andy, we're all there. So I don't care.
Yeah.
God doesn't necessarily live there. And I call it digital sins,
Hmm.
because digital sin, which is very interesting, is it's private. It is, you know, between you and this relationship.
Yeah.
No one needs to know. And when I did this assessment, first of all, before the assessment, I had a presentation in front of 600 young adults at a young adult conference. And I remember one person, a leader of the conference, coming up to me and saying, Andy, love what you say, but no one cares.
Hmm.
Like, all of everyone that you just talked to, they're on their phones 24 hours a day. Like they breathe it, they eat it, they
Yeah.
work, sleep, relationship, connect there. And with all the research that was coming out, I knew that it was affecting not just positively or negatively. So we saw that. The other side, and I'll get to the point, but the other side is people will reject digital spaces because of their own personal well-being. So there's other young adults that would say, Andy, I'm not on social media, for example. I'm on digital spaces for work and school only. I'm not there
Mhm.
because of my own mental well-being. And
Mm.
then there's the middle that I would strongly encourage is being redemptive. But the trends and themes is that students, I'll start with preteens and students. Preteens and students that have healthy relationships in their home actually have a higher cognitive reality to be able to filter through negative and harmful or hurtful information.
Mm. Right.
So Zuckerberg actually has confessed with their digital practices that they actually create harmful, hurtful, hateful information for young people to keep them gravitating to their platforms. This includes pornography. It
Mm.
includes comparing and competing and social and physical dysphoria. Like they have created negative context. And unfortunately, we as human species, we are wired to be shock and awe. And so as soon as you see an image, as soon as you see something, your brain is rewired,
Yeah.
especially with preteens and or preteens and youth. When you get to young adults, they're now adults. But the research would show that any consumption over 2 hours a day of digital practices outside of work and education, there seems to be like a cognitive inhibition. So you start seeing the effects, mild effects of infobesity, which would be comparing, competing. It could be death scrolling. It could be lack of sleep, blue screen syndrome, headaches, light headaches, not being able to focus on work or education, perhaps a lack of focus. So these are mild attempts, but coming out of COVID, our digital practices have actually increased. And so the infobesity symptoms continue to become more and more extreme.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Actually, there's a story coming out of Toronto where an 19-year-old student wanted to get a extreme selfie. So we did the research with the book on infobesity. It's in there, but people die more from extreme selfies than shark bites across the world. But anyway, this one guy, he's 19 years of age, was on a roller coaster in Six Flags, I believe it was. And in the middle of the roller coaster, he took his seatbelt off to get like to take a picture, a selfie, standing on as he's going down this roller coaster. And obviously, you and I know what happened. He was
Oh.
the roller coaster. His phone is broken.
Oh.
He gets injuries all because he wants to have an extreme selfie. So we have to
Wow.
pause and ask ourselves, why would that happen? Well, that's the extreme effects of infobesity.
Yeah. Yeah.
So we created a self-assessment to help people be personally aware and then
Mm-hmm.
create digital habits and then redemptive practices around their digital worlds.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Um, Paul Kingsnorth is a writer and a thinker who, in recent years, he'd always had a spiritual bent and moved
Mhm.
from agnosticism to mysticism to Christian conversion. And I believe he was, during COVID, he was baptized into the Orthodox Church. But uh, quite a writer and thinker. And he uses the term the machine to
Mhm.
describe the overarching colonization of modern life by technology. And he said something that I was a little bit amused by. He said, we enjoy telling ourselves that we will soon be gods, masters of the planet, manipulating the genes of living creatures and rebuilding the world at a nano level as we lie back in our hammocks, attended by our robot servants. I
Mhm.
don't And then he says, I don't believe a word of it, and I'm not sure many of us do. What do you think of that? Why what is behind this continual perpetuation of these utopian visions of technology?
Mhm. Yeah, so we talk about this in the book as well, because there's a French philosopher, and actually there's a Canadian philosopher as well. But Allal is a French
Well,
philosopher that talks about technology, and that technology, if not moderated well for the human well-being of humanity, will actually control us.
mhm,
In other words, being manipulated by someone's agenda or profit or capitalization of human vulnerability for their own personal gain. So that is technological ethics. And our world is wrestling through that right now. As followers of Jesus, I would talk a little bit about ethics, but Allah will say, if our technology, even with digital spaces, is not moderated well, then our personal well-being will be controlled by the technological advancements of society. And then McEwen, he's a Canadian
yeah,
philosopher. He also would agree with this point, where he would suggest that we become the medium of the message that is presenting.
right.
So
The
think of
message is
this.
the medium. That's right.
Yeah.
Yeah,
So, I have access to anything, anytime, anywhere with this thing.
yeah.
Um, I remember doing a philosophy class on technology at a university, and I just started. I wasn't planning to do it, but I just started and asked, "How much time do you think you're on your digital device for entertainment purposes?
Hmm.
So social media, video gaming, texting, chatting. How much?" So a girl shot up her hand and said 2.3 hours. This is post COVID. And then another one said 4.3, and I said it's actually higher. And then some guy in the back of the room said 25 hours a day. And the whole class just started to laugh exactly like you. They're clapping, they're cheering. Some people are like, oh, like with a modest, like shake the head. And he had something wise to say that day, because we become the medium to what the messages are providing. So if I'm consuming this too much, I become like this. I want free access. I want my algorithms or my bias to be affirmed in every context.
Yeah,
That's polarization of individual truth. Um, the consumption of what I want to consume is, I do that with relationships, and I can even do that with God. And so this goes back to Exodus chapter 32. Everything that we're talking about is actually a context of worship. So I say, when it comes to digital practices in the book of Infobesity, you are what you click. But this came down to, the golden calf debacle in Exodus 32, where the people of God are waiting for God. We're impatient, so they build their own gods. Some people believe that the golden calf represents the gods of Canaan, where they were living at that time. Some people suggest that perhaps it was a human way to worship Yahweh. We have nowhere to go, so we're just going to make our own. And others suggest that, and the biblical context, you see it in the New Testament too, is it's a way to worship the past. It was Egypt. So it was the sun god, or, this golden calf. I can propose all three of those could happen. But the debacle in Exodus 32 is a rejection of worshiping Yahweh to worship our own stuff.
mm,
So rather than worship the creator, we worship things that we create. And that's a great quote, is that we become our own gods. Well, how do we become our own gods? Because we're creating. We create our gods. So technology we create so that we can meet of all human needs. And so that leads to a philosophy called Technism. Technism is this concept of the hope of the world is in modern day technology. You're lonely? No worries. We'll have a human married robot for you that you can actually marry legally in the States by 2030. You want to look younger, there's going to be technology for that. You want to live or longer, there's going to be technology for that. Is there going to be cyborg or artificial intelligence? All these things, like at the end of the day, it comes down to this reality of Technicism, which is this flirtation of Exodus 32, where we just worship our shiny little things and technology per se, rather than the one who created technology, which is Jesus, which is God. And I'll get to that to a point, but this comes down to the ethics or the Christian response to technology. There's nothing wrong with technology, actually. It's great. Like modern day penicillin or education, even us connecting today. These are great things. Technology in itself is not negative. It's just what is the medium behind the message. And that's where human frailty rises. That's why, COVID has shown us that human technology can't answer all of our questions. So I call Technism the religion of the secular. But there's this term that Jesus is labeled as a carpenter. That word carpenter in the Gospels means tekton. So Tekton. And tekton is actually the root word from technology. So if we had a chance to geek out really quick with this, Kevin, is that Jesus was at the beginning. He created the heavens and the earth where it was chaotic, it was formless, and it was dark.
He was the original technician.
He was the original techie.
Mhm.
He's the original Tekton. And he created technology, if we want to keep it this way, to bring light into darkness, to bring purpose from chaos, and to bring order from nothing. And if we can use the creative abilities that you and I have and society to betterment of humanity as a follower of Jesus through the eyes of Tekton, then I am happy. I think we have a great opportunity as the capital C church to show innovation to the world like Google couldn't. And the other thing that I would suggest too is when Jesus is the ultimate techie, he created the heavens and formed the earth with his hands even, and yet he's a carpenter on earth. He came from heaven to earth to meet a need that technology will never be able to meet, and it's our human hearts. Because our human hearts are meant for worship, and we are what we worship. So the more time I'm on my digital device, like Elal and McLuhan and others would say, you start to become. And that's where modern day loneliness comes. This is where the mental health issues continue to rise. I would suggest the polarization of governments and polarization of personalized truths or sensitivity of truths rise because we focus on our bias, and it's kept us polarized as a society rather than bring us together. And this is where I think the local church has a great opportunity, friend, to be Jesus in a digital world.
Yeah, it makes me think of some other themes running through the scriptures. The idea of um, the 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 kingdoms of this world and the kingdom of our God, the empire building of the world and the shalom building of God. Uh, I just this past week I was able to pray with a guy that single dad raising an 8-year-old son, and just brand new into the faith, led him to Jesus, and a good friend of his had been discipling him and walking with him for a little while, but it impressed me how, as a dad with an 8-year-old boy, how sensitive this dad is to his son and what his son's learning in school, and just confronting that other kingdom And even though he didn't know Jesus, he, in his gut, he knew there was something wrong. There's something dreadfully wrong. And, the hope of Jesus, it's just like the light has come into the darkness.
Yeah, I will post this with this reality, but one thing that I think we could offer is have a think tank, a technological think tank for the Christian narrative of how to offer innovative and hopeful ways to share faith in digital spaces, but also have a redemptive response to the continued personalization of technology in the future. So we will continue to look into that, but it isn't surprising to me as I was going through the research on the other extreme is yes, an 8-year-old dad realizes there's gaps in their journey and they have focused on Tekton rather than technology. They have gone to the one who's created it, where why would we as a society want to create human-like robots? Well, it just feeds into our own selfishness to the medium of access and availability and my own biases.
Mm.
And so we will continue to wrestle with how to reveal Jesus who's for our souls. And we get it as followers of Jesus, but how does that look like for those that have put their faith in Technicism rather than Tekton? And I think this is where the redemptive practices come in because, most of our world, about 5.1 billion people, for example, are on social media.
Mm-hmm.
So what would it look like if followers of Jesus actually followed Tekton online? Like, what would that actually look like? Rather than be sucked into the hateful, harmful, hurtful information, we were able to share redemptive information.
Yeah.
And
Well,
I
let me
go ahead.
ask you that. What would it look like? Give me some pictures. Give me
Yeah.
some vision of how Christians could be better um, points of light.
Mhm. Mhm. So I used Jesus as an example for this. So 10% of everything Jesus shared, like the Sermon on the Mount, I would propose is the best famous speech of all time. He basically used information. He's sharing information. So I would call it helpful information. Then everything Jesus did, it was about 10%, but Jesus also used about 30 to 40% of his conversations through interaction. And so I call it like interactive information, asking questions.
Mhm.
So Jesus either asked or were asked about 300 questions when you read the Gospels. So as I've mentioned, information has been flatlined. What really helps is dialogue and from a monologue culture. So we're moving from monologue to dialogue and to more healthy conversations. So how to facilitate that? If you're a pastor or leader, it's important to facilitate conversations rather than just communicating conversations is the dialogue part.
Mhm.
You can connect with me with that. And then Jesus was a master storyteller, right?
Mhm.
60% of 50 to 60% of everything Jesus said was through stories.
Yeah.
And we actually, because we have so much information, what grabs people's attention more than anything, rather than harmful, hurtful, is actually storytelling or a good story. So going to Revelation is, what actually revealed Jesus into a secular culture was storytelling. It was the word of the lamb and the blood of, or sorry, the blood of the lamb and the word of their testimony in Revelations 12:11, I believe
Mhm.
it is. So it's our own stories. And if I'm able to share my own story online somehow to share faith, that becomes extremely important. And then secondly, because of what Jesus encouraged and what John wrote in Revelation, the church was experiencing the persecution like there was no tomorrow. And it started really with Nero, and there's many different reasons why. We don't know how many people died as Christians in the Colosseum itself, but we do know that 250,000 people died in the Colosseum over the span of that. The second thing we do know, and I'm geeking out a little bit about this, but the Colosseum was actually funded when Rome sacked Jerusalem. So in 70 AD, when the Romans came to sack Jerusalem, everything that they purged actually finished the Colosseum in Rome, which is quite ironic.
Wow.
And then and then number three is you see the rise of the Christian persecution, and they were different. So they were acting different. They would praise God, they would hold hands, they would pray to people. There would be Christians in the arena holding hands, praying when they're being, you know, slaughtered, and they weren't scared of death. They were just different. And it grabbed the Roman audience because they were different. I'm not suggesting that you and I will experience what Rome did to the Christian church, but what I'm trying to say as a parallel is being different online, being different as followers of Jesus that bless and praise and reveal Jesus rather than perhaps the medium of the age. And so we go through that in the book of how to do those redemptive practices as well as the assessment. So I will give a promo code to you, Kev, and to any of the listeners. You can
Mhm.
download it anytime for free, but there's a infograph that will come out of your real-time subjective logic, and it will help you build some redemptive practices. And as the book comes out, there'll be more ideas that we'll put on our website too, on infobesity.ca, about how to develop redemptive practices to share Jesus online.
Mm, mm. It seems to me that there's, I mean, when you think about violence, physical violence in the time of the early church, that was certainly the extreme of persecution. There are layers of persecution, but violence. There was no way to make it virtual. It was real. It
Right.
was the sword in your gut. It was the lion biting your head off. Um, in our digital age, we've moved so much of that violence that used to be real and physical, and we've now moved it all to mental
Mhm.
through technology, so that we're probably exposed. I wonder, are we exposed to even more violence than the early church? If you factor in
Yeah.
the amount of violence that we witness with our eyes, with our ears, in a virtual world. Part of that virtuality is, is that we recognize the fourth wall, right? We recognize that, okay, that's not real,
Mm.
uh, but maybe it's more real than we give it credence to. Maybe that violence is actually doing something to us that we don't recognize because we don't live in a violent Canada. We don't see blood on the streets.
Right. Yeah, I would agree with you, and I would echo that. And depending on your consumption of digital spaces, actually shows the pendulum or the level of online violence that is being interacted with, right?
Mhm,
And so
mhm,
there's layers, like you have mentioned. Unfortunately, we call it hateful information is a violent information. So
mhm,
hurtful information that we define in the book. So there's harmful information, hurtful information, and hateful information.
mhm,
The the context is and I would say sexual information, but we put that in one of the contexts of harmful information because we compare and compete with that sexual reality online, and it's private. You're not necessarily aware of it, but it's shaping you. Back in the mid 2010s, digital companies, especially social media, recognized that they were able to share hateful information. So I'm going to not give any examples, but there's more of the examples comes from the States. When there's hateful information online, people actually would consume more of that information.
Yeah.
So they gravitate to it. So
We have the same bloodlust as the time of
the
Christ.
early church. Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. And instead of being in the arena, we are the spectators of this digital, whether it's real or not, or perspective or not, we are dragged into it. And so you see it with Paul in Ephesus, right? So here's this mob that doesn't even know what's going on. They're dragging Paul. They want to drag Paul into, this Ephesus arena, and do whatever they want to do with him. And people are like, "What's going on?" Like, so it's, it's the same in digital spaces. Unfortunately, you have to know the medium, because if you don't understand the medium behind the message, that's where we become the medium. And when we see hateful, hurtful information, we interact with it, and then we become harmful or hurtful information. And as a pastor, I have seen that. I have seen the harmful effects of when someone decides to leave their husband and their kids for some online relationship that's not real,
Mm.
but they thought it was real at the time.
Yeah.
Or a young adult leader who, for whatever reason, had, like, we talk about digital detoxes and digital free zones. One of them we would encourage is your bedroom or your bathroom, especially for young people. But it was in a private area where a girl took a picture, she sent it to a friend, and that friend wasn't a follower of Jesus. But 2 years, fast forward 2 years, that same person came to our young adult ministry, gets saved, and here's this young adult leader now wrestling through shame and guilt and hurtful information because she was embarrassed
Yeah.
of sending these photos.
Yeah.
That was 30 seconds. So we would try, the book talks about this, just understanding the medium, understanding your digital practice so that you become redemptive, so that you can share not harmful but helpful information and interactive information. And we give ideas, of course, and inspiring information through storytelling, like Jesus did in the New Testament narrative. It would be quite a unique reality. And there's many different thoughts. Like, for example, um, there is people thinking of having like a Christian social media community, or how do we be able to communicate if Google or other companies thought that Christian information is now hateful or harmful, they can shut everything down. So how do we share those platforms, or how do you get the gospel in places that can't communicate it yet? At this point, everything is okay, but no one knows what the future is in that context. And then artificial intelligence is just another algorithm, really. It just is filtering through information
Yeah.
because of the medium.
Yeah.
So it's amazing. Of course, I love it. But at the same time, it's too personalized at this point. So again, it comes down to how to redeem digital spaces as well as technology to show Tekton, not my own selfishness or greed.
Yeah. Yeah. Andy, how do I know that you're not AI?
Yeah, exactly. Exactly. Yeah. And that's the equation for relationship
Yeah.
and the soul. And so
I have the advantage of I've met you in person and know you a little
I'm
bit.
not I'm not a I'm not a bot.
No, no.
Yeah. Yeah. There's a great book called You're Not Listening by Megan. I forget her last name. Sorry. I'll put it on the podcast.
Okay.
But she did a research possibility. So what happens with violence, as you know, we don't listen. We just polarize and judge, and we make digital spaces a weapon.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
And she suggests that up to 80% of our social media platforms are run by bots, either
Wow.
relational bots or AI bots, or from the digital company big tech bots. And they are feeding that hurtful, harmful, hateful information.
Mm.
That blew my mind,
Yeah.
because it's not just artificial intelligence, me knowing if I'm real or not. It's also behind the scenes fueling that violence or hurtful information.
Hold up your hand. I want to see if you have six fingers. Yeah.
Yeah,
Yeah. No. Okay. You're real. Okay.
yeah. Yeah, how funny, man. Yeah.
Um, hey, I just really have one last question for you, and I'm sure that people in your orbit
Mm.
ask this question. Some of them have that concerned hand on the shoulder look when they ask this question, but how do you maintain the volume of work, study, and creativity that you do in balance with family and spiritual formation? What are some of your key pieces, key practices that keep you healthy, rested, and focused?
Yeah, this is a great question. I prayed through this one. There's three things I would share. And this comes from a book called Grit, and it's a book around passions and abilities. And then there's another one by Levinton. He's a Christian psychologist, and he talks about performance in the brain. And so I'll push out three things. I think the first thing to realize is that we're all called. So we are all called with something, and God has created that call. He's whispered into us. And so I push it into three different areas: perseverance, passion, and people. And so based on my story, based on everything, I think that God has just called me in a unique season to be able to create and be able to share my story through my experience. And then it's always been about people. Like, I love people, so that helps me grind through it. And then that leads to the second thing. It there is suffering, and so there is a beautiful reality of suffering. And I need to mention this. So I actually failed grade two
Hmm.
growing up. And I actually have a learning disability. It's a speech impediment called clumping or clustering. So my brain actually is going so fast that I actually can't keep up with my auditorial processing skills. And so in grade two, the psychologist and teacher and the counselor said, Andy's bright, but he is just having a hard time being able to communicate. So we think that if we put him back a year, it's like riding a bike. He might not be able to ride a bike yet, but he will get on the bike and he'll be able to do this, and he'll do great. But he'll never be a professional speaker. He'll never be able to speak in his job or profession. How ironic now. But I have come to realize that as someone you know, who loses eyesight or ear, their senses, and their other senses are heightened, my brain doesn't shut off. Like, from the moment I wake up to the moment I go to bed, my brain has ideas and innovation, and like, God, I don't know if God's whispering to me, and it just comes out and flows. And I'm just like I have, yeah, it's just crazy. I've never seen that, but that's just, I would say, the storyline I've had. And then the last one is discipline. So we only have 24 hours, so I call it the 888 principle. So I work 8 hours, I sleep for 8 hours, and the other 8 hours I just flow with my family. And so I flow with my relationship with Jesus, of course. Everything flows out of him. And so I love reading God's word. And I usually do it in my back deck over a coffee, either in morning or night. And I just let God whisper to me. And those are very special moments. I go on date nights with Annick once a week at least. And because we're at a local church, we're doing it together. Like I mentioned, my family too. So everything's not separated. It's not like compartmentalized. We do it all together. And that's been a beautiful picture for me. And growing up in a business home, it's the same thing with my dad. Everything was kind of together. So we would work, but then we go out for a meal together, or we would do something on the farm, and then we would do something, a fun activity. And so my parents taught me really young, don't be scared of hard work, but if you do it well, if you have good rhythms, then you could do it with people. And so my family has been really great with that. And when I'm writing, it's like sometimes I'm just on my phone, an idea comes and I'm just like, and it's on a plane somewhere, or it's, in the early morning. And every day out of those 888, we usually have a creative zone. And so that creative zone is like we call it the green zone. So there's green zones, yellow zones, red zones. You don't want to write or be creative in yellow or red zone. Your red zone is when you just need to reflect and just decompress. The yellow zones where I usually tend to do is through relationships because that feeds me. But those green zones are usually in the morning, but sometimes it happens late at night and I just write it down and then it happens. I don't use AI, like my book, for example. It's not through AI. It's all written by me personally. And as creative thought continues to come in, I just use as much time as I can by myself, or I'm watching a hockey game with my kids, or I take some time just to write. And there's no right or wrong about those rhythms. It's just what
Mm.
works best for you, to be not busy but productive. And there's seasons where I have to go hard, but then there's seasons where you recover. And again, that's my story. I used to play sports all throughout high school, even a little bit in college. And so when you go hard for sports, there's a recovery process before and after, right? There's pre and post prep. And so I'm just kind of in that sweet spot right now, Kev. Like,
Mhm.
and maybe that's going to change in the future, but I feel great. And people ask me this all the time, this question. But honestly, it's been a lifetime of content, if I can put it that way.
I said that that was the last question, but I'm a preacher, so
Go for it.
going for second closing here.
Sure.
Uh, you mentioned this condition as a child. I think you called it clumping, where you had so much thought that your auditory system couldn't keep up with it. As a kid going through that, was that a real vulnerability for you? Was that a something that brought you a lot of consternation and struggle and pain, or uh, I'm just wondering, how that part of your development informed your spiritual formation.
Oh, absolutely. To unpack it, I was embarrassed at first, right? Like I'm a grade two, so I'm with all my friends playing soccer at lunch, and then I'm put back another grade. I was embarrassed. I was angry. I was angry with my parents. I was angry with myself. I thought to myself, like, how could this be? But Levinson talks about this with when it comes to energy and drive, that part of it is our genetics. Like part of it comes out of just how we're born. And I have no other thing to say with this next part, but the next part was I just am overly optimistic. So even though in my anger and my frustration and my embarrassment, had this optimism that I am going to show them. I'm going to deal with this. And I didn't disagree with them. It's true. It's clumping or clustering, and it's a learning disability that I was able to go through. But I believe this might sound very cheesy, but I believe God healed me from it too. I think God has used those weak parts, those suffering parts in my life to be redemptive. And I've always had a decision to be able to do that or let it define me, right? And fast forward it 20 or 12 years later, I'm a valedictorian in my grad class,
Yeah,
communicating
yeah.
actually the gospel a little bit to 2,000 people that are strangers to faith, because of God's grace.
Mhm.
So I think that people underestimate the power. I'm sorry to say this, friend, but the power of suffering, because it creates character and it
Yeah.
creates an opportunity to be productive and reveal what it takes to make a difference in this suffering world.
I think there's a thread there that is really, really thick if we would pull on it. You know, that out of those negative, weak, vulnerable things that happen in childhood, God has a redemptive plan that includes that,
I
and that suffering given to God becomes something beautiful. And yeah,
Absolutely. And anyone who's listening to this, like, we all suffer to some degree, but don't let your suffering cause further suffering. Let it be redemptive, you know.
yeah.
Don't let your scars, whether they're church scars or family scars or personal scars or relationship scars, define you. Heal and help other people with their scars.
Well said. Well said, Andy. Andy Gabruch's been my guest today, and thank you so much, Andy, for just a great conversation. I love having these conversations, especially when it's somebody like you that just has, volumes of interesting things to say, and yeah, a walk with Jesus to back it up. Thank
Thank you.
you.
It's an honor to be with you, Kevin, and thank you for our listeners too.
That was so good talking with Andy Gabruch, and I'm going to take him up on his idea about the think tank and invite him back as a guest on an upcoming future episode. I'm not sure when we can schedule it, but I want to talk to him and some of his peers just as we unwrap some of the issues around technology and finding the balance, and just so many good thoughts there. Anyways, our next episode, we're going to be talking again with Tim Meisenheimer. Timothy Meisenheimer started the Capital City Mission in Ottawa. He worked at Ottawa City Mission. And at the Our City Windsor Conference, he brought a session where he talked about the perspective of Jesus that we see in the Beatitudes. Tim's experiences working on the streets of Ottawa and now on the streets of Windsor, he has so many rich stories and so many insights about what it is to walk in the Jesus way downtown. So join us again, will you? I'm your host, Kevin Rogers, and you've been listening to Sidewalk Skyline Podcast.
Studio 61.